We are in part four of week six of Biblical Worldview 1. And at the conclusion of part three, we had discussed the demise of both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And because of their disobedience and their idolatry, their depravity, all of the characteristics that the prophets had talked about, judgment had come. And the 10 tribes that made up the northern kingdom of Israel had gone into Assyrian captivity, never to return. The Babylonians, of course, invaded Jerusalem in 586. They burned Jerusalem. They burned the temple to the ground. Most of the survivors were moved to Babylon, and the presence of God was lost. The promised land was lost, and the question is, what would happen next? And this section of the Old Testament basically talks about life during that 70 years of exile, and then the steady but slow return back to the land. And this will, of course, include an overview of a lot of the historical books that are placed in a near the end of the Old Testament because of the chronological uh, presentation of the narrative. And one of the dominating features of this is, whereas last week we were talking about the role of these foreign nations, Assyria, and then of course Babylonia. During this section, Persia is going to be the ruling empire of the region. And we had noted in part three that here again the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians, and near the Babylonians, of course, conquered and destroyed Jerusalem. And then at the beginning of the book of Daniel, the Babylonians are still in power, and during Daniel's life and ministry, the Persians will conquer the Babylonians. And throughout all the other books that we'll note, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Persians are the dominating and ruling empire of the region. The book of Daniel is included with the prophets in our English Bible, and he does do a lot of prophesying, but there's also a lot of history. Daniel was one of the first of the people from Judah who were carried off into Babylonian exile. He was probably taken as a teenager in 606 in one of the first deportations into Babylon. And he will live and prophesy under actually three world empires: the Babylonians, the kingdom of the Medes, and then, of course, the Persians. And what stands out in throughout the narrative of the book of Daniel, of course, is his faithfulness to God, which would have been in stark contrast to that of the general population of people. The first six chapters, the kings of Babylon and Persia are powerless, of course, before the God of Daniel, and Daniel's faith is symptomatic of that. And then chapter 7 through 12, there's a contrast between the empires, the world empires, and of course the kingdom that God Himself would establish. And so we see that described in detail in the book of Daniel. And there is this also, from a historical standpoint, this reference to the Jews are wanting to go back. And Daniel, in fact, is the one who will go into the Persian ruler Cyrus with the book of Isaiah and read to him how God had prophesied that Cyrus would be the one to allow the people of the kingdom of Judah, the former kingdom of Judah, to go back home. And so Cyrus does this. And so beginning in 539, Persia defeats Babylon, and 3 years later, uh, Cyrus allows some of the initial uh, Jews to return to Palestine in order to rebuild. And Ezra and Nehemiah record these efforts, and the exiles return, and then there's a struggle, of course, to rebuild Jerusalem, not just the city of Jerusalem, but the temple and their entire culture. 538, under the leadership of a man by the name of Zerubbabel, the first wave of exiles will go back to Palestine, and the objective there is, of course, to begin to rebuild the temple. And they start, but they don't finish until many years later. But Ezra records at least the initial efforts in rebuilding the temple. 548, there'll be another group that will go back to Palestine, and they will be led by a priest under the name of Ezra. Ezra's objective, of course, is not only in the rebuilding of the temple, but rebuilding the spirituality of the people. And for 70 years, they had been without that, and now the intent is, of course, to restore the spiritual dynamic of the nation. 445, there was the third return of exiles back to Judah, and this was under the leadership of a man by the name of Nehemiah. His role is going to be rebuilding the walls and the gates of Jerusalem, and his book, of course, records those efforts. And so you had three groups that went uh, back to Jerusalem and the surrounding area, first and foremost to rebuild the temple, which they start, and then, of course, then the rebuilding of the culture and the community, and then Nehemiah's efforts to rebuild the walls and the gates of the city, all three of which would have indicated permanence in that regard. In the throes of all of this, there is an interesting sidebar story, and it's not recorded in either of these the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but we do sense the success in rebuilding the walls and the gates. As I mentioned earlier, there's limited success in a couple of areas. They had not completed the construction of the temple. Their worship, uh, consequently, also was still suspect at this point. They continued to struggle. If you remember back in part three, the three things that the prophets were constantly chastising the people for was idolatry and social injustice and religious ritualism. Now, the idolatry had been taken care of, but they continue to struggle with the injustice and religious ritualism, and those are still going to have to be dealt with. There was still not a Davidic ruler in place. And as I said a while ago, the issues of oppression of the poor and the ritualism of their worship were still persisting. And the temple hadn't been completed, and God's presence was not evident in that regard. And in the throes of this, and I alluded to this a while ago, while Ezra and Nehemiah were doing all this work and their efforts in Palestine, there was another incident back in the capital of Persia, and it involved a young woman by the name of Esther. And if you have an opportunity, you need to read that short little book because it chronicles the life and the career of a young girl who marries the king of Persia, and because of the drama and the efforts on the part of some to exterminate the Jews, she is the one who will intervene and ultimately save her people. There's some unusual facets about this little book. Uh, there's no mention to religious practice in the book. No mention of prayer or sacrifice. There is a reference to fasting, but so consequently, there's no mention of God anywhere in the book, and yet one cannot read it without getting a glimpse of God's providential care. What the book of Esther does do is it gives us a snapshot of what it was like for those Jews who chose not to go back to Palestine. If they stayed in captivity, then this is a glimpse of what their life was like. Ultimately, Esther is a story of God's grace being extended to the Jews uh, who did not return to the promised land. And there were many who opted to stay where they were because many of them, uh, because of 70 years, many of them had been born there in Persia, and they just chose not to return. We now turn to that period of time known as the post-exile. This would be after 536 BC. And we now see the role of these respective prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They're known as post-exilic prophets, post-exile, after the exile. And both have their respective roles. Haggai and Zechariah are in Jerusalem around 520 BC, and Haggai is going to continue to uh, encourage and motivate the people to complete the rebuilding of the temple, which had stopped. Zechariah focuses on the coming day of the Lord, the establishment of the kingdom that will be realized in the New Testament. Malachi is almost 90 years later in 430 BC, and he is going to direct his attention to how the people can live and worship as they await the establishment of the kingdom. And now you see we're getting closer and closer to the realization of the coming of the Messiah. Malachi records, surely the day is coming. It will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble, and the day that is coming will set them on fire, says the Lord Almighty. Not a root or a branch will be left to them, but for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise, and healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. Then you will trample on the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decree and the laws that I gave him at Horeb or Sinai for all of Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. And so this prophecy, of course, uh, of one who will pave the way for the coming of Messiah. I will send my messenger who will prepare the way for me. We believe that, of course, that John the Baptist is the one to whom Malachi is foretelling, and the New Testament identifies John the Baptist as the one who prepared the way for the coming of Jesus Christ. And so we have several lessons to draw on from this final section of the Old Testament. Daniel reminds us to stand strong even if all the world opposes us. Do not be too overtaken by the powers of this world. What a relevant lesson that certainly is. From the book of Nehemiah, sometimes the true Christian leader has to kind of kick in a closed door of opportunity, and Nehemiah certainly did that. Do not shirk away from difficult responsibilities. He did that. We live in a world right now that we, have to accept things by faith, and we work to strengthen and build up God's people. All, of course, looking forward to Jesus' ultimate return. Uh, Daniel closes by saying, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And so when we get to this section, the people are back. They're back in the land of Palestine. They're rebuilding. They're reconnecting from the standpoint of the temple and the walls of the city of Jerusalem and the entire community. But now they're still waiting. They're waiting for that one event that is still about 400 years out, and that, of course, would be the emergence or the coming of Jesus Christ. And it's to that discussion and that subject that we will turn our attention to in week 7.